L&D practitioners have the responsibility to fundamentally change how workplaces work. And you absolutely have the role to change how you tell not only that history, but what the now is.
Welcome to this Learning Uncut Elevate episode, where Michelle Parry-Slater explores a topic, skill or resource to help you elevate your practice and impact as a learning professional.
Welcome to another episode of Learning Uncut. Today we have an Elevate episode. And as you know, if you've been a long-time listener, these episodes are designed to elevate our practice in learning and development. Before we begin, in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community, particularly the Kombumerri people whose land I'm joining you from today. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present or listening today. I'd like to welcome our wonderful guests. We have Nareen, we have Josh Gilbert, who are joining us from the University of Technology in Sydney. I'll let them make their own introductions, but as a personal welcome, this is a conversation that I have wanted to have since I arrived in Australia nearly 2 years ago. So welcome, Nareen, and welcome, Josh. What country are you on today?
Well, where I am, it is contested ownership. I am in fact descended from the traditional owners of what some people refer to as Gadigal. I and my family, our Fowler descendants, are supporting the claim pursuant to the Native Title Act in New South Wales of the Bidjigal people for formal ownership of this land, which is what we now call the inner city of Sydney.
Thank you, Nareen. Josh, hello.
Hi, yes, I'm Josh Gilbert. I'm a Warramai man and I live and work on country. So here on our country and Gatung, which is our common language that we share with our neighbouring tribes, we say, "You Barrabarai, you Warramai Barai, Geta Niran."
Help me out. I'm learning as I go. Help me out. What was that all about?
It's our language. It's one of many Aboriginal languages right across Australia. It's unique, I guess, to our mid-north coast of New South Wales, and it says, "Who's what are you doing here? This is my country. This is war on my country, and let us go together on our journey ahead."
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, it is an absolute pleasure to have both of you here today. I wonder, Nareen, do you want to tell us a little bit about you and the work that you do?
Yes, and we say here our language of the Sydney Basin, we say Warramai, which is hello. We at the Centre for Indigenous People and Work established, so Josh, I'm the director, Josh is the assistant director. I am also the Associate Dean, Indigenous Learning and Engagement at the Business School at UTS and a Professor of Policy, Indigenous Policy at the Jumbunna Institute of Indigenous Education and Research, also in UTS. That's the Indigenous Institute within the university. I have been an employment practitioner for a long time and have specialised in diversity employment practice for a long time and been a leader in that. I've led 2 peak bodies. And about 11 years ago, I started at one of the large Indigenous consulting firms, exclusively practicing in employment for Indigenous people. And that's where Josh and I first worked together. Josh was very young in those days and I was younger. And 8 years ago, I was appointed to Jumbunna. We established the Indigenous People and Work Research and Practice Hub then. And then a year ago, with a joint venture of Jumbunna and the Business School at UTS, we established a centre, so a university centre for Indigenous People and Work. And Josh is the assistant director who'd been working with me on a whole lot of employment things for the last 11 years and had fashioned himself into a really prominent Indigenous employment practitioner in his own right, and so was the perfect choice to work as the assistant director. Our centre aims to own the Indigenous employment narrative for Indigenous people. We are both Indigenous people. We have an advisory council that is all Indigenous people, headed up by Tanya Hosh, who's a very prominent Torres Strait Island woman here in Australia and has been an activist around constitutional recognition, was the Indigenous officer at the Australian Football League for many years, has led many Indigenous employment programs in various forums. We do industry-based employment research. I was one of the pioneers of, with Professor Jane O'Leary, we pioneered Australian industry-based employment research that is very much applied. We pioneered that when we were both at Diversity Council Australia, and now we have applied that in the Indigenous context. And that's what we do. And we utilise our Indigenous-led research to inform policy, to inform practice, and to inform workplace reform.
Wonderful. Thanks for that introduction and that context. Some people might be listening thinking, what's this got to do with learning and development? They might be thinking, what's this got to do with the wider conversation? And I think that the context from an outsider, as I feel I am looking in, is this really that I mentioned at the beginning, this is a conversation that I've wanted to have since I arrived in Australia nearly 2 years ago. And I also want to say that I'm probably going to get a lot of this wrong in this conversation today because I'm still learning. I don't know enough about the history. I don't know enough about the complexities, the sensitivities. But I do know that I'm here, I'm learning, and I'm inviting everyone else to learn alongside me because I genuinely believe that diversity in all of its forms, diversity of place, of thinking, of background, of experience, it makes us all better. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation on our podcast today. But it is an unusual conversation in a lot of Australia. And I think that for our global audience to understand that context, that it isn't something that I've heard, for example, on a conference stage, apart from very recently when I was at the L&D symposium and both Nareen and Josh gave an impressive presentation, and they're going to share some of the statistics and information about that today. But that in and of itself is quite an interesting part of the conversation. You know, why aren't we talking about the contribution from Indigenous people within employment, like you've just been mentioning there, Nareen? You know, why is it not just a normalized conversation, as it perhaps might be a little bit more of my background in the UK? So that's why we're here. That's why we're having the conversation. And Josh, I'm curious about your introduction. You mentioned about how you are on country, a phrase which I hear, on country, not in country. Help me understand a little bit about that. And your work in agriculture is connected to your work in reconciliation. How does all of that fit together?
Yeah, I think it connects to the employment narrative really well, actually. So I guess I'll start with some kind of context, and then I can explain the on-country piece. So our land here on Warramah country was gifted to the biggest agricultural company, one of the ones that still exists in Australia, 200 years ago. Upon getting gifted that land, our people worked for rations and like no rations. So there's a line item in 1838, 2 years after they kind of got given our land, that says that they paid £100 to mob for services rendered with tobacco and maize, which is a seventh of what they paid to feed the horses for that year. So actually, the employment experience has always been something that has happened to Indigenous people rather than through Indigenous people, and us kind of reclaiming that narrative. And the very point that we have to make of trying to get the narrative back and to therefore have our own conversations and our own self-determined right in the way in which we describe this stuff kind of explains the fact that we've got a lot of work to be done. So I'm very fortunate. My family's from here. All my connections are here. Um, this is absolutely where my cultural ties roam, and I guess being on country is a part of recognizing the fact that it's not just in one place, it's a connection that spans right across this large geographical area. It's the connections to the mountains and the trees and the way in which we feel safe and embody this kind of country through our actions as well. So that's where the term on country comes from.
Thank you.
Our country isn't just the dirt in the ground, it's in us, and it's in our physical being and in our emotional and spiritual being. And country to us is the land, the water, the ancestors who created it and have nurtured it for 65,000 years. It is part of our being. And so for me, I'm a saltwater blackfella. The salt water for me is my place of familiarity and where I feel comfortable and best. It's my Nura, it's my place. And I'm not speaking for Josh, but his Warramai country is his Nura, his place, and it's everything to us. Our country it defines us. Yeah, is that reasonable, Josh? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly cemented in our psyche of who we are as
Yeah.
people and where we connect and where we also, I think, resonate with each other as well. So when people describe what country they're from, it gives us a visual memory of what that is and the way in which we relate through country, through places that mean something to us and the way in which we relate through that.
Thank you. It's almost something that what am I trying to say? I can't feel.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's part of the problem because I don't feel that. I don't know. I'm just exploring here and learning as I go. Okay, well, what I do want to talk about is Gary Yala. You explained this when we were together in a room in the Hunter Valley at the symposium, and it was revelatory for me to hear the research that you had shared. So, Nareen, can you tell us a little bit about that research and what it's revealed this time round? What even is Gari Yala? And that sort of, what surprised you? What did it confirm that you already knew?
Well, for starters, as Josh so well articulated, we have never owned our own employment narrative. So the populist myth is that we're bludgers, we all live on the dole, um, we don't want to work, we have to have specialist employment programs because we haven't worked and we don't have the skills, which is simply not true. And the longer that you're here, the more you will hear that, particularly from people like Pauline Hanson and various elements of the conservative hierarchy. And that really goes to the notion that there was no one here and we didn't own this place. There was terra nullius when the British invaders got here. The land was then our land was then taken, as Josh has just spoken about his um, family's experience. Their land was gifted to somebody else. Our land in Sydney was settled, and it was very quickly taken and cleared. And our people, in the very early days, there was a smallpox epidemic, and our people were put onto missions and reserves in the Sydney area, including my family, and in Camperdown. Um, and your children were then taken, especially mixed children. My family were Randwick Destitute Children's Home, and so we were excluded from very early on, formally, from the employment and labour markets. But our people have gone to every length to be included and to participate wherever and whenever they could. So, for example, when Josh is talking about being provided rations for instead of pay, that was still prevalent last century in some parts of the place, in some parts of the country. And of course, these are the things that have meant today, for example, with the prevalence of diabetes in our communities, that is, of course, as a direct result of being fed flour, sugar, and tea and tobacco on the missions instead of being paid wages. And there's a lot of intricacy and nuance to that exclusion. And there were some places where, for example, the railway sector last century, where we began to be included, and on the waterfront, which is largely due to the trade union and the nature of that trade union insisting that our men be included, and our women were removed from families and then trained as domestics, and so were servants, but again, not paid wages. So it's a very difficult and nuanced history, which has led to this myth that we haven't participated in the paid economy, that we haven't wanted to work. And it's a very convenient myth for politicians to run. So we wanted to establish our centre so that we controlled the narrative, that we're very proud of our people's contribution to the development of the modern economy. We understand what that entailed. We deal with a very deficit-based model. People still refer to Indigenous employment. I saw a seminar advertised by people who should know better last week called Indigenous Employability. So what does that say to you? That only last week there was a seminar being advertised that was about saying, I don't know, what was that saying? That our people, the Indigenous people, need to get their shit together and act like we have employability. Is that what that is? Is that we don't know how to interview, that we don't know how to present ourselves? So even in the most subtle ways, we are painted within the Australian economy as deficit somehow, right? So our aim with our centre is to own that narrative ourselves, to address that, to be about far more than special programs to put Aboriginal people in jobs, in programs, in low-skill, low-paid jobs for certain amounts of time that are government funded. Our work is about deepening the understanding, which some employers do, that we are very capable, very resourceful, very intelligent, very talented people who can make an equal contribution at all levels of the economy. So whether that's board directors, whether that's senior managers, whether that's line managers, whether that's all of the things that everyone else does, and everyone else has an expectation they can do, we want to own that narrative so that's understood.
And where does Gari Yala fit into that, Nareen?
So Gari Yala, it won't surprise you to know in context that until 2020, when we ran the first Gari Yala survey, Indigenous people had never, ever, ever been asked about our employment experiences. So that was a glaring omission that our Indigenous People and Work Hub needed to fix very quickly. And so we Josh and I put together a survey that, we first of all put together an expert panel of Indigenous people who came from across the employment industry spectrum, union officials, lawyers, academics, employers, where we designed the survey and we led the work. We did the data analysis and we wrote the report. So it is Indigenous run. at every level. Gari Yala means speak truth in Wiradjuri language, and we acknowledge Dr. Lachlan McDaniel for organising for us to use that language. And it has had a huge impact because it is so different in the Australian context.
Josh, do you want to tell us a little bit about the report itself? What did you find? And I know you've run the report twice now, haven't you, the survey? So has there been a shift? Has anything changed?
Yeah, and I mean, that's, as Nareen pointed to, it's pretty fascinating that it's taken over 200 years before Mob can actually run our own survey that tells our stories of truth about our employment experiences. So for me, I think fundamentally it was a chance then, and still remains so, for Mob to speak truth to the activities and actions that are occurring to them at their workplace, and to see where their experience is taking them. So we know, maybe some context, I guess, first for your international listeners, but Indigenous people in Australia are the most over-researched peoples in the world. Every kind of research question you probably could think of has probably been asked, mostly by non-Indigenous people who have kind of spitballed a theory and then thought that they'd go out and test it with Indigenous folk, which often means that Mob don't respond to surveys or don't want to participate in research. It's actually quite common that data sets are quite small because Mob have just had enough. That kind of over-research and over-analysis keeps happening, and therefore Mob kind of just say we're not wanting to participate. So one of the first things, actually, when we got the responses back from Gari Yala, is we had over 1,000 responses to the first survey, and that for us was quite telling. It really spoke to the fact that the way in which we were designing the methodology and the way in which we were consulting was actually being, that it's comfortable. It was mob-led, it was mob-driven. People could see that all the information was going to be told in the positive, proactive lens, rather than the kind of terrible lenses that had been happening elsewhere in the environment. And there was a lot of comfort in that, and we saw that replicated again in the 2025 survey that we did. So in the more recent Gari Yala in 2025, we had 1,158 respondents to that survey. So it's growing by about 10%, which I think is pretty good for survey data. Importantly, too, we had a broad intersectional approach to people who had filled out the survey. So it's not just all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living in Sydney that filled out this survey. We had good representation from across the country. We had a good mix of gender diversity. We had mob with disability. We had, what we think is a good sample of people who have very different caring responsibilities as Indigenous people, a very broad spectrum of different representation. And for us, that's really important. And what we've done subsequently with the Gari Yala data set is looked at the intersectional approach around how people with disability, for instance, or mob with disability, have a very different experience just to mob without disability, and using those kind of intersectional approaches to understand what nuances are needed. So I guess you asked, what did we find? Well, maybe if I just highlight some of the key things, because the report, I think we asked about nearly 60 questions. It was quite a lengthy survey. Also, a thing that I think a lot of people would say, surely people turn off midway through. Well, actually, no, like people kept filling it out. So despite it being a very lengthy survey, Mob wanted to still make sure their voices were heard. So what we found, people wanted to identify at work. Nearly 90% of Indigenous people say that it was important for them to identify at work. But actually what was triggering in response to that was that 60% said that their workplace wasn't culturally safe or only moderately safe. So Indigenous people bring their identity to work. We share who we are as people and our culture. But 3 out of 5 times that you do that in the workplace, you're going to be met with a very culturally unsafe place to do that. I think that for me is a massive finding. The other thing that we always talk about, by having an expert panel with Gari Yala, we talked originally about going out and asking people about their experience in the employee life cycle. And our expert panel said, no, go and talk about racism. So we went out there and made sure that we did that and followed their guidance. And what we find, very similar to the last Gari Yala, is that racism is still common. About 60% of Indigenous people experience racism at work very often, or sometimes, which is pretty stark. And the most common thing, or one of the more common things that people hear, are racial slurs and jokes at work. And by comparing the analysis between the 2020 report and the 2025 report, we estimate, based on the rate of change between those two reports, it would take 118 years before an Indigenous person can go to work and not hear a racial slur. So they're the kind of key points. Like that's the experience that mob are experiencing. There's a lot of other data that sits underneath that and a lot of other findings. But I think for me that they're the ones that really speak out and are really prominent when we keep going out and asking mob about their experiences. That's the feedback that we keep getting.
And the other thing, Michelle, is in terms of trust, of course, is that our people are still, in many instances, but always have been, treated as anthropological subjects when it comes to research. We haven't tended to be, and still, and I sit on a university ethics, on the UTS ethics committee's Indigenous component, and I still get amazed as to the kind of ethics applications that people make about surveying and researching Indigenous people. So there is the element of trust. And of course, Jumbunna is a really trusted Indigenous source. And so the response rate is high.
118 years has just shocked me. We have to be able to support speeding that up. We work in learning and development. We have access to generally 100% of audience within an organization when we work in learning and development. So let's turn our minds to what can we actually do? What is the opportunity here? I know that your research has come up with 10 truths, for example, about reconciliation action plans, which I understand not everyone has. But where they do have them, it does make some difference. But is that white Western press telling me that, or is that actually a truth? What separates a good rap from a bad rap? When you talk about those numbers there, Josh, about racism in workplaces, I'm wondering if the whole approach of reconciliation action plans makes a difference. Because in learning and development, we can support culture to shift. Is it worth investigating reconciliation action plans in work, or is there perhaps other things that ought to happen instead?
Yeah, okay. So I think absolutely raps make an impact. So we've just released a data cut from Gari Yala, which cut the information as to whether organizations have raps or don't have raps. There were about even samples, because apparently that makes a massive impact for some of the audiences out there, but about 50% of the people who responded to our survey had raps, 50% didn't. It's not quite that clear cut, but it's around that. So we're pretty comfortable with the findings. But what we found is that those organizations that do have raps actually create a much better workplace experience for Indigenous people. They're less likely to be subject to racism. They're less likely to have a cultural load or an unpaid workplace demand placed upon them. They're much likely to kind of keep going up to work and keep turning up. So the experience there is very different if you have a reconciliation action plan or not, which I think is an important a message that I think organizations should, in fact, be investing in those. We also know that the other two things that make a big impact are anti-racism training packages, which you think L&D organizations should be doing, but actually most don't. Only 36% of workplaces in Gari Yala said that their workplace actually had an anti-discrimination training package that they were doing. And the other thing that we know that is really impactful is a racism complaints procedure. So only 1 in 3 people who responded to Gari Yala said that their organization had those. And those organizations with RAPs were most likely to have both of those strategies in place. So I think they have been a strategy that organizations, if they follow it right and do all the right things that RAPs ask of them, actually are having a disproportionate impact on the Indigenous workplace experience.
And I think there's two elements to what's working and what's not. First of all, RAPs provide guidance and a framework, right? So if you comply with the agreements that you've made with Reconciliation Australia in terms of implementing your RAP, then you're going to have a better workplace for Indigenous people, and our stats say that. RAPs are not a silver bullet, but those ones that do incorporate anti-racism procedures are going to be better for Indigenous people. But the issue is this, that what's gone on with the HR industry and the L&D industry, whereby the requirements of the Racial Discrimination Act, which has been in place for 50 years this year, aren't complied with in terms of training. So it is actually a matter of compliance that you do need to convey the anti-discrimination components that are required in your workplace. You do need to convey that to be racist at work is actually unlawful. You do need to convey that you have a complaints procedure and that it's accessible. So I don't know what's going on with you, Mob, that these things haven't been dealt with. But I also think that what RAPs do in an L&D context is all that beautiful cultural learning and knowledge that can be provided about our culture and country and land that you live and work on. Everybody works and lives on country. I mean, I always found it very entertaining when people would say to me that they had to go to Uluru or go up, and mix with Arrernte people up in the territory to experience the real Aborigines. And you'd just be like, you live 5 minutes from Redfern, or you live 5 minutes from Mount Druitt, or you live in Kempsey, and yet you don't understand that we're just as much the real Aborigines as everybody else. So, because I live in the inner city on country. So it's quite gobsmacking to me, I suppose, the lack of exposure and knowledge that most Australians have about this place and our people who nurtured it for them to have this bountiful life for 65,000 years.
What you've just described is exactly why I was so shocked that we don't have these conversations. To your point about the racial discrimination, I have a huge interest in compliance training more generally. And it's been for a long time tick and flick, just get the
Yeah.
tick in the box. And I'm really pleased to see that actually the judiciary is saying that that's no longer acceptable. That there's been presidential laws in place to say that we need to actually make sure behaviors change as a result of this. So, I'm singing from the same hymn sheet with regards to that for sure, because for 50 years to have something in place that's not then recognized. This is why I've been kind of like, where have I moved? Like, what is this place? How is this like this? But like I say, I don't understand the intricacies and the complexities. I'm not making excuses, but I want to amplify the conversation, because it's only by having conversations like this that we get the opportunity to learn more and to know what we can do, which will make a difference. So that sort of practical guidance for learning and development practitioners, yes, you shouldn't just be ticking and flicking when it comes to any compliance, let alone when it becomes, when it's racist compliance that you're trying to fight against. So what we're talking about really is how we connect these subject matters into the wider strategies, into the systems of organizations, the structures that are inherently different than they absolutely need to be.
Yeah. And that's what we would seek, that RAPs become holistic business as usual mechanisms. And to me, as a long-term diversity practitioner, and as I said, having led a couple of diversity peaks, First Nations is, in my view, and I think anyone would be hard pressed to argue with it, the Australian diversity fundamental, right? So if you begin to get us right, you're going to get a lot more stuff right.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is an incredibly diverse country now. I was recently at a ceremony for a friend of mine who's become a citizen, and there were 48 different countries represented in a hall full of 200 people. And yet there is a perception that there is one way of thinking, the white Western way.
Yeah, but I don't know. Well, as one of the Socceroos said last week, that's the great thing about this place. The whole world is in one place, right? And it is, and it's so very cool. But the prevalence of the thinking of us, the colonizer, is still, we're still within that prism kind of thing.
100%, 100%. And I can see it as a British person moving here. I can see mindsets that have left Britain 20, 30, 40 years ago and are still here. And that's just been shocking and fascinating to me, and why I wanted to have this conversation. The opportunity, therefore, is ripe for learning and development and organization development practitioners listening today to say, well, what can we do differently? There's a risk to L&D taking this on without genuine First Nations partnership or leadership. Is there any way that you can suggest, how do we get mob involved? Am I even allowed to use that phrase, without causing offense? This kind of goes through people's minds. And so how can I sort of work in an organization and think, yes, I want to do genuine anti-racist training? What does that look like? What thoughts?
So I guess we always encourage organizations to do an audit internally of what their own Indigenous experiences are. So we often work with workplaces, go in and ask a series of questions through surveys and yarning circles to actually understand what the Indigenous employee experience is within organizations. For many workplaces, that can be pretty shocking for them to hear. So we present Gari Yala quite frequently, and I think the common mental stimulation that leaves with organizations is, oh, that's everyone else, that's not us. And I think the ability for us to go into workplaces and talk with mob and get those voices and elevate those to leadership is really powerful. We're doing it recently with an organization, quite a big company, and you could just see the mental toll shift fundamentally when they were hearing from their own staff, and seeing the experience of direct racism within their workplace, and then realizing that they're going to have to do something about it. So if you're not aware of it, or you think that this is an issue that's happening out there rather than internally, then I think getting people like us to come in and have a yarn with your Indigenous staff is a really great starting point, because it very much flips on the head what that experience is. It also kind of tells, we have one workplace, for instance, that they had quite a number of Indigenous staff, none of whom would identify to their managers. So you can start seeing where these pockets of challenge exist and where the work needs to be done. That's certainly, I think, a good fundamental first step. You need to know what mob you have in your workplace and what their experiences are. And then often I think our work is to really try and elevate that, and then go off and share with some of the strategies that we know work. So doing all the work that we kind of highlight in Gari Yala and saying to workplaces, this is what you should do, this is a process to follow. What I struggle with Gari Yala is that when we did the analysis this year, what we found is that the 10 truths that we presented in 2020, there had been very little change that happened between then and 2025. And what we've done this year is we've used Reconciliation Australia's truth-telling framework to say, this is us truth-telling, that's the first phase. Actually, what comes next is truth listening and then truth acting. And that's a real invitation, I think, to workplaces and to L&D, practitioners who have got people coming into their workplace to actually start thinking about what is the truth of that place, how are you listening to it, and then what are you going to do to act upon it. And if you're not doing that process and really listening to your staff and listening to their experiences and then doing something about change, then I think you too are complicit in the way in which mob are experiencing that racism and that workplace culture. And it's a real invitation, I think, to say, actually, these are the practices you need to change, and this is why.
When I was in the UK after George Floyd was murdered in the US, the response of one of my major clients at that time was exactly what you've just described. The CEO said, I am not equipped to lead a conversation here. I am a white middle aged man. And he said, what do you need in order to have this conversation? I'm listening. And I think as a response to that murder, it was very powerful. And the employee resource group then had a conversation, a whole staff conversation. And people in that conversation who'd worked at that organization for decades, not years, but decades, said that every day they felt that they could mask at work because that was the way that they got through the day. And that was shocking for people sitting next to them to hear. And I feel that we're at this kind of inflection point now that, do you actually know who you're sitting next to at work? And what would it take for them to actually unmask to you? So does this start with self, not even with learning and development, not even with HR, not even with organization development, but each individual listener here today? What is your response to this? Does it feel uncomfortable? If it feels uncomfortable, just question to yourself, why? Why is that the case? And it's not necessarily then about you feeling comfortable. It's actually living and sitting with that discomfort in order to move the conversation forward. Nareen, have you got anything to add with regards to that sort of guidance for L&D? I mean, this is never going to be a single training intervention, is it? It's never going to be one thing. But to hear that the 10 truths haven't shifted, we need to shift them. Come on. I need to help you.
It's the unlearning. And I think that, not even us, but particularly us, we are just surrounded by negativity and negative images of ourselves and our people our whole lives. And so, we have to unlearn and decolonize and heal ourselves. And we do. And, the really great example of that to me is Indigenous tertiary participation and how that's, skyrocketed in the last 20 years. And I don't know anyone who doesn't make their kids go to uni these days. Any black fellas who don't make their kids go to very few, unless we have kids who just really wouldn't suit it. But, everyone I know raises their kids with the expectation that they will go to uni. And that is real healing because that's not a system that has welcomed us ever, and it's still not easy. So I think if we can heal ourselves and take that responsibility and take responsibility for ourselves in so many ways where we can, and the degrees of difficulty of the impact of grief and trauma and dislocation is different for every single Indigenous person in the place. But if we can do all this reflection and we talk and think and reflect on our place here and what we do and how we do it and how that impacts all the time, I think that everyone else can too. And those reflections to me are a personal responsibility, and the responsibility to unlearn and to be part of the healing of the place is everyone's, every individual's, and it's immense. And we work with people of goodwill all the time, every day. And people who, you go and report to them. And I mean, the shock sometimes irritates me because I think, where have you been? You walk around this joint on a daily basis, and to be shocked by jokes that I'm sure you've heard thousands of times in your life, that's a bit irritating. But the kind of ashen-faced, no response just moves me sometimes. It moved me quite recently when Josh and I presented recently about this rather large company, and there was just a whole lot of people in the room, really senior executives, who just said nothing. Like, you could tell they were gobsmacked, not shocked, but distressed by what clearly, goes on in their organisation. And there was a pocket of defensiveness, and, that sometimes comes from surprising quarters as well, the defensiveness. But I just think it's everyone's responsibility, and I would have thought that learning and development professionals could be key because, and I'm an educator. I was trained as an educator. I think it's the kind of educator's brain that's curious and reflective, and I never get upset when people say to me I've said the wrong thing. I never do that thing of, oh, I might say the wrong thing. Well, you know what? If I do, apologize, take it on, and move on. I get irritated by that one too. Oh, I can't do this because I might say the wrong thing. Well, so be it,
But if you don't try,
if you don't try, so
exactly.
maybe L&D professionals are exactly the right people to move this on because we're inherently curious and like learning new things.
Yeah. I genuinely think that there is definitely that curiosity. And also, you keep mentioning the word reflective. And Josh, you did the same. Reflective practice is where the learning is, as far as I'm concerned. There's a whole chapter in my book on reflection because I think that that's really important. So, a lot of people say it's because I'm married to a history teacher. We look backwards to go forwards. But knowing more about the history, I think, will help people to feel less.
I wouldn't rely on that. We've been, I've had elders saying to me for 30 years, they're ignorant. Once they get educated, they'll be different. And that hasn't changed it. Workplace training, cultural awareness, workplace training hasn't worked.
Okay. So then there's a reflection on what's not worked. That needs to be looked into by the profession. So it's no good just saying, let's do more anti-racist training if the training's not actually hitting the mark.
Well, I don't know that in Australia we haven't had a culture of anti-racist training, actually. What our training has been is cultural awareness and cultural competence and all of this stuff. It hasn't actually been anti-racist. And so that's what we're trying to push that change.
Okay. I'm curious, really, as I said, from the history angle, but you've written a book about the history of agriculture in Australia. And I wonder if there's a reflection within looking at that can help us to look forward, because obviously that's what's gone on before. But what I'm curious about now is what can we do to make things different for the future?
Well, I mean, agriculture doesn't have very many good news stories, I think is my summary as to what the book has uncovered and what my personal experience is. So while it's been a sector that has definitely demanded probably the most of mob from across the country, it was really seen as the sector that was going to drive this new economy. I mean, Australia is quoted as being riding on the sheep's back as terms of how our economy was formed. What we do know is that there is very limited kind of conversations and truth telling that are happening in agriculture. There are very few, organizations, perhaps less than 5 agricultural organizations that actually have a reconciliation action plan. Very few that are even prepared to lean back into their history and understand what their tales are. And I guess I use this example all the time, but I think it provides the most kind of reality around what that behavior is. But the agricultural company that got given our land, they celebrated their 200-year anniversary recently. And at the same time as that they were celebrating that, they championed 200 years of success at an event. They invited the Prime Minister along. Their stock ASX kind of commentary in their annual report that year mentioned it 5 times that they were turning 200 years. At the same time, a researcher discovered that they were involved in a massacre, and that their people were involved in, they're actually involved in many, but they reported on one, and they asked the company about their history and whether they wanted to comment on that. And they very plainly said to the journalist, "Oh no, we don't want to talk about our history." So you've got a company that's celebrating 200 years and saying, "Look how great we are. We've been doing this for such a long period of time, but we want to turn a blind eye to anything that isn't good." And they're aware of these behaviors. I mean, I've sent them emails and I've had correspondence with their staff, and we've had the conversation. And here we are on our country still saying, "Just come and meet with us and have a yarn." And we can't even get the conversation started. We can't get them to commit resources to flying down here and just to have a conversation with our people. At the same time, they'll happily come down and listen to a white historian tell their history at a book launch. So that's the kind of reality that we're dealing with. And I think fundamentally for me, and what my response would be to your earlier question to Nareen, is that L&D practitioners have the responsibility to fundamentally change how workplaces work. And you absolutely have the role to change how you tell not only that history, but what the now is. The Gari Yala stats that we shared before aren't just a historical record. They are what's happening within workplaces today. And that's fundamentally a gap in terms of what training we're providing, how we're providing it, and kind of who's actually responding to it in a fair light. So for me, that's the real invitation, that these things have to change. You need Indigenous people as being part of those training packages. We've got data. Jobs and Skills Australia recently released a paper that said you need mob at the front of the room teaching people, and that has a better response for mob. And that's absolutely, fundamentally true, that we need mob, doing the training and providing the information at the same rate as what we have non-Indigenous people doing that. If we change all those bits and pieces and do all the right things, then actually we're going to have a much better workplace, and fundamentally change how Indigenous people play within the system, like what opportunities are presented to us. But also then, I guess, thinking broader for organizations, your customers and clientele are fundamentally changing to a more Indigenous demographic. About 1 in 15 people will be Indigenous in 2050. And that's really going to start questioning how you have relevance with those customers and those staff if you're not kind of doing the fundamentals now.
But we need to close. I feel like we could talk about this for hours, but I do need to close us off. I just want to leave you with one last request. And that is there anything that you haven't had the opportunity to say today that you would like to say to our global audience of learning and development professionals and our Australian audience as well? Any final thoughts, Josh?
One of the things that scared me and worried me most at the L&D conference that we met at recently is that we have this idea that the AI revolution will kind of fix everything, and that it will be the savior going forward. And I think I just want to reinforce the fact that if you have garbage going in, you're going to have garbage going out. And if you already have systems that aren't prioritizing mobs' views and values and learnings, AI is not going to solve that for you. So actually start doing the grunt work and the groundwork now. Start engaging with mob and start thinking about what that connection and relationship looks like, particularly through the 10 truths of Gari Yala, and start having the conversations now so that you don't end up with a very broken system into the future.
I'm so glad I asked the question, because you're absolutely right. AI has been fed with the white Western view and does not represent the global majority at all. So thank you for mentioning that. Nareen, any final things that you haven't said today that you would like to say?
I think that what Josh touched on about the increase in the number of Indigenous people in the workforce as our population grows, because we have a lot of babies, and that's a good thing. But I just would say to Australians, and often you get feedback from people who aren't Australian, just going, "Oh my God, what is wrong with that place?" Open your hearts, for goodness sake. Like, the meanness of the discussion, the national discourse at the moment does my head, and it does most of our heads, most blackfellas' heads, because, we live by if you don't want to be discriminated against, don't discriminate. So we love seeing all the difference here. We understand that we're a very small part of the population, but that it's a good thing to have the diversity and the difference and the variety and you know, trans people and LGBTQIA plus people have always been part and a loved and valued part of our communities, and until the imposition of Christianity. And, you know, we were a diverse landmass until colonisation, where people did welcomes to country to acknowledge diversity and safe passage when we were on each other's countries. So think about our ways and we'd have a much nicer place.
I really just want to give my generous and truly heartfelt thanks for this opportunity to have this conversation. And I hope that people that are listening, that they take away from this what has been so generously offered by the pair of you today, to just start thinking differently about all of these subjects, even if they feel uncomfortable, even if they feel like me, I don't really know, so I'm trying to learn. And just the opportunity for us all to live and work more closely together is really the future that I hope that this will start to trigger. So thank you, Josh. Thank you, Nareen.
Thank you for
And
having
to
us.
anyone who wants to discuss more, I'm going to put into the show notes how they can get hold of you, and certainly to the report that we've been discussing, the Gari Yala report, and to those 10 truths as well. So thank you very much. Until next time on Learning Uncut, we'll leave you with this one for you to ponder over.
Yanu.
Thanks for listening. Head to the learninguncut.global website to access resources mentioned in this episode and more to help you elevate your practice and impact.